As much as I would like to take advantage of the offer, I cannot. I've been over the same ground and reached the reluctant conclusion that this is one job of work that I have to do myself. Taking off those nuts looks entirely too easy, and that's what makes me suspicious. I'm going to do it and look out for any more trickery at the same time, and that is something that only I can do. Now, I suggest you withdraw with the troops to a safer spot." There was no hesitation about leaving. Footsteps rustled quickly on the sand, and Jason was alone. The leather walls flapped slackly in the wind, and there was no other sound. Jason spat on his palms, controlled a slight shiver, and slid into the pit. The wrench fitted neatly over the nut. He wrapped both hands around it, and bracing his leg against the pit wall, began to pull. And stopped. 3 turns of thread on the bolt projected below the nut, scraped clean of metal by the industrious mica. Something about them looked very wrong, but he didn't know quite what. "Mica!" he shouted, and had to call loudly 2 more times before his assistant poked his head tentatively around the screen. "Nip over to the petroleum works and get me one of their bolts threaded with a nut, any size, it doesn't matter." Jason warmed his hands by the stove until Mica returned with the oily bolt, then waved him out to rejoin the others. Back in the pit, he held it up next to the protruding section of Upsilon bolt and chortled with joy. The threads on the angle bolt were canted at a slightly different angle. Where one ran up, the other ran down. The Upsilon threads had been cut in reverse, with a left-hand thread. Throughout the galaxy there existed as many technical and cultural differences as there were planets. Yet one of the few things they all had in common, inherited from their terrestrial ancestors, was a uniformity of thread. Jason had never thought about it before, but when he mentally ran through his experiences on different planets, he realized that they were all the same. Screws went into wood, bolts went into threaded holes, and nuts all went onto bolts when you turned them with a clockwise motion. Counterclockwise removed them. In his hand was the crude Zertano nut and bolt, and when he tried it, it moved in the same manner. But the engine bolt did not work that way. It had to be turned clockwise to remove it. Dropping the nut and bolt, he placed the wrench on the massive engine bolt and slowly applied pressure in what felt like the completely wrong direction, as if he were tightening, not loosening. It gave slowly, first a quarter, then a half turn, and bit by bit the projection threads vanished until they were level with the surface of the nut. It turned easily now, and within a minute it fell into the pit. He threw the wrench after it and scrambled out. Standing at the edge, he carefully sniffed the air, ready to run at the slightest smell of gas. There was nothing. The second nut came off as easily as the first, and with no ill effects. Jason pushed a sharp chisel between the upper case and the base plate where he had removed the solder, and when he leaned on it the case shifted slightly, held down only by its own weight. From the entrance to the enclosure he shouted to the group huddled in the distance, "Come on back, this job is almost finished." They all took turns at sliding into the pit and looking at the projecting bolts, and made appreciative sounds when Jason leaned on the chisel and showed how the case was free. "There is still the little matter of taking it off," he told them, "and I'm sure that grabbing and heaving is the wrong way. That was my first idea too, but the people who assembled that thing had some bad trouble in store for anyone who tightened those nuts instead of loosening them. Until we find out what that is, we are going to tread very lightly. Do you have any big blocks of ice around here, Edipon? It is winter now, isn't it?" "Ice? Winter?" Edipon mumbled, caught off guard by the change of direction, rubbing abstractedly at the reddened tip of his prominent nose. "Of course it is winter. Ice. There must be ice at the higher lakes in the mountain. They are always frozen at this time of year. But what do you want the ice for?" "You get it and I'll show you. Have it cut in nice flat blocks that I can stack. I'm not going to lift the hood. I'm going to drop the engine out from underneath it." By the time the slaves had brought the ice down from the distant lakes, Jason had rigged a strong wooden frame flat on the ground around the engine and pushed sharpened metal wedges under the hood, then had secured the wedges to the frame. Now, if the engine was lowered into the pit, the hood would stay above, supported by the wedges. The ice would take care of this. Jason built a foundation of ice under the engine, then slipped out the supporting bars. Now, as the ice slowly melted, the engine would be gently lowered into the pit. The weather remained cold and the ice refused to melt until Jason had the pit ringed with smoking oil stoves. Water began to run down into the pit, and Myka went to work bailing it out, while the gap between the hood and the base plate widened. The melting continued for the rest of the day and almost all of the night. Red-eyed and exhausted, Jason and Myka supervised the soggy sinking, and when the D'zertanoj returned at dawn, the engine rested safely in a pool of mud on the bottom of the pit. The hood was off. "They're tricky devils over there in Appsala, but Jason dinAlt wasn't born yesterday," he exulted. "Do you see that crock sitting there on top of the engine?" He pointed to a sealed container of thick glass, the size of a small barrel, filled with an oily greenish liquid. It was clamped down tightly with padded supports. "That's the booby trap. The nuts I took off were on the threaded ends of two bars that held the hood on, but instead of being fastened directly to the hood, they were connected by a crossbar that rested on top of that jug. If either nut was tightened instead of being loosened, the bar would have bent and broken the glass. I'll give you exactly one guess as to what would have happened then." "The poison liquid?" "None other. And the double-walled hood is filled with it too. I suggest that as soon as we have dug a deep hole in the desert, the hood and container be buried and forgotten about. I doubt if the engine has many other surprises in store, but I'll be careful as I work on it." "You can fix it? You know what's wrong with it?" Edipon was vibrating with joy. "Not yet. I have barely looked at the thing. In fact, one look was enough to convince that the job would be as easy as stealing krenoj from a blind man. The engine is as inefficient and clumsy in construction as your petroleum still. If you people put 1/10 of the energy into research and improving your product as you do into hiding it from the competition, you would all be flying jets." "I forgive your insult because you have done us a service. You will now fix this engine and the other engines. A new day is breaking for us." "Right now it's a new night that is breaking for me," Jason yawned. "I have 2 days' sleep to make up. See if you can talk your sons into wiping the water off that engine before it rusts away, and when I get back I'll see what I can do about getting it into running condition." End of Part 3 of The Ethical Engineer, by Harry Harrison.